Okay, so lately I've been making Lord of the Rings videos, and I'd like to draw connections between Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones. If you are not interested in that idea, skip ahead to this time frame for Game of Thrones Season 8 predictions. For those of you that have chosen to stay right here, I'm proud of you.
I'm proud of you, Morty. Hey man, I don't give a crap about myself, Rick. Let's watch some crazy stuff, yo!
Now, generally speaking, in the past, I've seen this idea mostly unfold like this. Hey, wow, Game of Thrones is kinda similar to Lord of the Rings.
Wrong, sir. Wrong.
For those who say there is little or no similarities between Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones, I say this.
Wrong, sir. Wrong.
First, let's consider the obvious. They are both the same genre, fantasy. I understand genre is not everything, but it lands them in the same ballpark.
And nothing someone says before the word but really counts.
But
Game of Thrones and Lord of the Rings also share a well-known actor, Sean Bean.
That don't impress me much.
How about this? Most people agree that Game of Thrones is dark and philosophical and violent, and characters die, and bad things happen. Within the extended film trilogy of Lord of the Rings, the story is dark and philosophical and violent, and characters die, and bad things happen.
That's fucking interesting, man. That's fucking interesting.
The Fellowship of the Ring is undeniably dark and pessimistic, with only a glimmer of ambiguous hope given at the end of the film.
Am I wrong?
No.
Am I wrong?
Does that sound similar?
Fucking A.
By the end of the first film, of the 9 members of the Fellowship, 2 of them are dead, 2 of them are captured, and the remaining 5 are cut off into separate groups. Does that sound familiar?
This looks strangely familiar.
Early in the journey of the Fellowship, they lose their leader, Gandalf. In Game of Thrones, King Robert of Westeros and Khal Drogo of Essos die very early in the story, and both characters play a significant leadership role. Eddard Stark and Jaime Lannister are captured. Merry and Pippin are captured. 3 hunters, 3 kids. Frodo and Sam. Frodo and Sam. Jon comes back to life and hope is restored. Gandalf comes back to life and hope is restored. Sean Bean. Sean Bean. Still, people may say, well, but Game of Thrones is complex. There are several characters somewhere in between good and evil, which makes them interesting. The characters in Lord of the Rings, although not nearly as complicated as some of the Game of Thrones characters, do still have complexity and shades of gray. Not often from the main protagonists, but more so from the supporting characters, be it the flaws of Boromir.
What chance do you think you have? They will find you. They will take the ring. And you will beg for death before the end.
The festering, skeptical nature of King Theoden.
Tell me, why should we ride to the aid of those who did not come to ours? What do we owe Gondor?
The forlorn, weary tone of Faramir.
His sense of duty was no less than yours, I deem. You wonder what his name is, where he came from, and if he was really evil at heart. What lies or threats led him on this long march from home? He would not rather have stayed there. In peace.
The duality of Gollum.
Well, I saved us. It was me. We survived because of me. Not anymore. What did you say?
Or the grieving insanity of Denethor.
But against the power that is risen in the east, there is no victory.
If pressed, I would say the truly defining feature that separates Game of Thrones from Lord of the Rings, aside from some distinct elements, is within the overall tone. Lord of the Rings is ultimately a sweet story, whereas Game of Thrones is more bittersweet.
And that's all I have to say about that.
Moving on, let's talk about my Game of Thrones Season 8 predictions regarding who will win the Iron Throne. Now, if you had asked me a few years ago who I thought would win the Iron Throne, I probably would have said Peter Baelish. But in Season 7, well...
For all your many lessons, Lord Baelish, I will never forget them.
Needless to say, he's not my number one anymore. But I do still have a top 5 list that I have come up with. Number 5, the Night King and the White Walkers. Now I know this wouldn't be fulfilling, and if it does happen, the show will end on a dark and depressing note, because I can't imagine any of the characters really surviving or escaping if the White Walkers win. So basically, everyone dies and the dead win. Number 4, the Iron Bank. Now look, I don't think this scenario is very likely either, but it would be a strange and interesting twist of fate if the show had a casino-style ending and the house always wins. The money men of the Iron Bank win because they financed everyone, they let them all kill each other, they put the Seven Kingdoms into foreclosure and repossess all of Westeros. And it would have a kind of cute rhythm to it. The Iron Bank wins the Iron Throne. Number 3, Cersei. No surprise here. Cersei is currently sitting on the Iron Throne. In this scenario, either some of the North survives but are too depleted from a zombie war to go after the throne, or all the characters we love are killed by the White Walkers, but Cersei uses Wildfire and the remaining loyal armies of Westeros to defeat the White Walkers, which would provide a kind of dark philosophical epilogue that Cersei, who most people despise, is the one who saves the kingdom. Number 2, no one. I really think it would be both possible and compelling if no one wins the Iron Throne and King's Landing is completely destroyed or left in ruins. I like the philosophical notion of the throne being destroyed or left behind. It would also be ironic that arguably the main point of the show is the question of who will end up on the throne, only for no one to get it. The kingdom is ravaged and depleted through infighting, zombies, and dragons, and ultimately, no one gets the Iron Throne. Number 1. Daenerys and Jon, or either one, but with a twist. Here's how it would go. Daenerys or Jon, or both, kill the White Walkers and defeat Cersei, then one or the other or both sit on the Iron Throne. The important thing is that they win, and a Targaryen child is born, let's say a baby boy. This Targaryen boy is now the prince of the Iron Throne. Then, let's say 5 or 10 years flash forward, here's how it ends. We see Tyrion sitting in a garden, watching the Targaryen prince from a distance, and as he gets closer, he sees the child is smashing beetles with a rock.
Damn!
Not only would this ending be ominous, eerie, and foreboding, but it would also tie the cyclical nature of the show together. And it would reaffirm the Targaryen incest Mad King plot idea. The history of Westeros will again be doomed to repeat itself. Some may feel an ending like this is too dark or too self-defeating, but I don't think it would be. The whole point of the hero's journey, the central focus of any story, is the status quo. A good story typically ends with a new status quo, an upgraded version of a previous world. If Daenerys or Jon or both come to power, it is likely that their reign would be more peaceful and more responsible than previous rulers. And even if the story ends in a similar way to the backstory of how it all began, with a mad Targaryen king, it does not mean that history will repeat itself forever. The new power structure that comes after a Mad King 2.0 will in theory bring about an even better status quo than the power structure brought to the realm by Daenerys or Jon. So that's it, those are my ideas. I'd love to hear what people think of these ideas and would love to see how people think Game of Thrones is going to end. Finally, I just want to mention I have another channel called Audio Insights. It has fun audio clips that I put together. There's even going to be some Game of Thrones stuff over there, so consider checking it out. Until then, I'll see you next time.